Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming back down. All the way down from outside, and someone said that things were literally on fire even before my talk started, so I'm happy about that. I'm gonna be speaking with you today about subjectivity and objectivity in decentralized systems, and really perhaps a more accurate description of what I'm actually going to be talking about is the values or value of the value instruments that we are building. So it's going to be a little bit of a more philosophical governance, ideology-oriented talk than the more technical talks that I've been giving before. So if this is disappointing to you and you really want a technical talk, then I can give a little announcement that there will be an impromptu formal verification workshop happening 2 o'clock tomorrow. So if you're interested in that, then get in touch with me and I'll tell you where that's going to happen. It's going to be a little more intimate, just get in touch with me and I'll tell you the location. So what inspired me to give this talk was a presentation that I saw at Chaos Communication Congress on ethics in mathematics by Maurice Chiodo, who was speaking about the enormous influence that mathematics is having on the world and how little mathematicians are willing to acknowledge this fact. You know, a lot of mathematicians are really happy with solving problems of geometry and statistics and analysis, and they don't particularly care for whether what they're working on are going to be used for calculating the jail sentence of some number in a database to them, whether their work is going to be used to calculate the trajectory of a ballistic missile, or whether it's going to be an algorithm that decides who's going to hook up and potentially create the future generations. So this is obviously an enormous impact that people have, and in any profession, you shouldn't simply disregard the ethical implications of your work. And I think in the blockchain space, we're more willing to acknowledge that there is an ethical dimension to what we do. In fact, I think that's what attracted most of us in the first place to the space. But when you speak about ethics, it's really hard if you don't really have an underlying theory behind what you're reasoning with. So I want to present a theory on value that I found very helpful for analyzing value instruments, the type of value instruments that you can build in decentralized systems, and go through a couple of case studies so to hopefully make this more concrete instead of just talking about this value theory from an abstract perspective. So let me begin. As I said, what we're doing is constructing value instruments. So we're really constructing something that we need to understand. In order to construct value instruments, we need to understand what value is. As these instruments that we're building have the potential of having tremendous impact over people's lives. In some cases, we're building weapons of death construction. In other cases, we're building some weird derivative of some possible future value, and we're constructing really dreams about what the future can be. And then we need to be aware of the methods by which we create the future that we want. So we're doing this in a setting where we're renouncing traditional institutions. And usually we don't speak very clearly about what particular aspects of these institutions that we don't like. We just say, well, all of these centralized institutions, they're so bad because they're controlled by a few actors. But I think we really have to be more sophisticated in our analysis of precisely what features of these institutions it is that we don't like, and what are acceptable, and which ones of these features we want to bring in to this sandbox little utopia that we're building on the blockchain. And I also think that it's important what language we use to describe these systems. I really have a hard time with a lot of the double meanings of some of the words that we use, like consensus. Like when we speak about decentralized governance, and oftentimes when people refer to systems as democratic, they're not really democratic at all. We speak about incentive reasoning, and we speak about things being valuable. I think we should be more granular about these things. And we should really talk beyond incentive reasoning. I mean, crypto economics is really just a very narrow view of what economics is this microeconomic perspective that really is just game theory, rather than the more holistic view of the resources in a system and how people function to distribute those resources together, which is a more macroeconomic perspective and a more sociological behavioral economics. Nobody really talks about that. So here's a little bit of how I would like to approach the matter. I'm going to be spending most of the time talking about the method, which is based on an anthropological theory of value, mostly developed by David Graeber, or at least articulated by him in the way that I understand it. And then I'm going to apply this theory of value on a couple of systems. And there's going to be some opinions in this talk. Sometimes I'll make a big red warning when they are. But since a lot of this talk will be a little bit abstract, I thought that I would just begin by stating a couple of concrete opinions so that we can really start engaging in a discourse about this. So here are my opinions. The first one is an opinionated question, which is, how decentralized are plutocratic systems really? Because I really think that most of the systems that we have built upon the blockchain are plutocratic right now. And I don't think that that's as good as we can do when we want to build decentralized systems. And as a result of that, there's a significant lack of democratic input to on-chain applications. And that's obviously a hard problem, but I would like to give some opinions on how I think it can be approached. And finally, tokenized securities represent legacy financial values, and we should not embrace them without a critique of what these values are. We should take this opportunity to reconsider which ones of these contractual obligations that the state has invented we really accept as legitimate. So the method here, as I said, is based on an anthropological theory of value that is really embracing the double meaning of value as it is being used in the economical sense, the value of a particular asset, and values in a sociological sense when we speak about values like friendship or honor. You know, depending on your culture, you have different opinions on what these values are, but what unifies these two notions of value is that they're ultimately speaking about conceptions of desire that influence the decisions we make in our lives. And one way to think about how this bridge between value and values work is that it really has to do in what direction the analysis is happening. So if you're a microeconomist, then you might start from utility function and model people as trying to maximize their utility. And so you have a predefined notion of what they value, and then you try to get a model for how they're going to behave. Whereas in anthropology, you would start by looking at how people behave, and then try to figure out what their values are based on how they act. And it becomes really apparent if you try to reverse this analysis. If you ask an economist to explain the act of gift giving, for example, then they start saying, well, they're really trying to give a gift because they might get something in return. And then you're like, well, what about anonymous gifts? And they're like, well, they're really trying to maximize their good feelings or self-worth or something like that. And once you start talking about those values, then you're really not that far from the sort of soft values that people speak about in a sociological sense. But there's another way to understand the double meaning of value and values that goes through the concept of tokenization. And I mean this in a broader sense than just the tokenization we do on the blockchain. It's really taking some abstract value and manifesting it as a token of value, as a representation of this value. So some examples are the value of education being tokenized in degrees or certificates from a particular prestigious school. The value of science being tokenized in the form of grants, citations, or publications. The value of art being tokenized in art reviews or awards or artist retrospectives, or ideas being tokenized as intellectual property. And whenever this act of tokenization happens, there's a curious phenomenon that happens with humans, which some people refer to as a fetishization of these manifestations. We start pursuing the manifested token in and of itself, instead of pursuing the token because it represents some value that we might value. So people start to go to university not because they want to get educated, because they want this degree, or people start only caring about their citations if they're doing science, and so on. And it happens in every regard. And this is a little bit related to the concept of gamification. Whenever there's like a high score, you're going to pursue the high score instead of actually pursuing whatever the high score might represent. And this is particularly obvious in the case of money, because money is also representing something. I mean, it's a little bit complicated to decipher what it represents because it's so fungible and so detached from the origin of the value where it was created. But I think there's no clearer case of this objectification and fetishization that happens than in the case of money, where people really start pursuing money for money itself rather than the things that they can get with it or the values that it represents. So it really has to do a lot with fungibility as well. And we have to realize that what makes money fungible is the fact that other people are also acting according to this common hallucination that it actually represents some form of desirability, some form of value. And it's very easy to break down this fungibility if you go to some place where people don't accept your form of currency. Then, you know, it doesn't matter that your actual cash bills or your little bitcoins are actually fungible, because they don't actually transfer the value that they are meant to represent if people don't care about this particular currency that you have. And this also gives an interesting view, or I think a helpful way to think about the different values that fiat currency and cryptocurrency represents. Because the value arises pretty much not only from the various ways in which people use it, but also the systems and the mechanisms by which it is created and the way that it can be recognized by institutions. And fiat money is getting a particular kind of encoding with the contractual rights that it can represent. And the things that you can buy with money, the fact that you have to pay tax with fiat currency and so on, makes it encode a particular kind of different value than cryptocurrencies do. So if we want to think about what values cryptocurrencies represent, then we should look at the underlying values of how people created them and why people created them in the first place. And it should come as no surprise that the most tangible arguments for why they are being created is the argument of decentralization. And I think people understand this concept fairly well, so I'm not going to spend too much time on talking about it. I just want to highlight another double meaning that is in decentralization from the perspective of the system design or the system architecture, and decentralization in a more ideological sense where power is being diffused. But this double meaning is kind of useful because the diffusion of power happens through the technological means. So I'm not saying that we should separate the two, but I'm just saying that when, for example, people say that users don't care about whether your app is decentralized or not, then it is true that they don't care about where the servers are being operated or whether you're using the blockchain or you know, the technical infrastructure they don't care about. But they do care about, or they should care about, the power structures of the system that you're creating. So they do care about decentralization, or they should care about decentralization in the political sense. And so this diffusion of power comes through open participation. You have permissionless networks, and open non-participation, the right to fork and to do your own thing, the right to opt out of the system completely, and if you don't like the way in which the platform is being governed, you can just create your own platform. And when we start talking about platforms, I want to emphasize a difference that I think is useful in order to understand this non-participation, because it's really a distinction between non-participation in a protocol and non-participation in a platform. And it also has to do with governance. So I like to think about protocols as rules of interaction, a communication protocol, and platforms as places of interaction. And the key distinction here is what happens if you want to fork. I mean, if you fork a protocol and start acting to the protocol in some other place, then arguably you're in the same protocol still. You're acting according to the same protocol, but if you fork a platform and start doing your own thing in a different place, then you're on a new platform. We can think of Ethereum as a protocol, but the particular Ethereum blockchain that presumably everybody here cares most about is a platform. And if you start doing your own chain, then that would be a different platform. So platforms have an objective state. Sometimes maybe not global, but they at least have a state that defines the platform. Whereas protocols, they have more views and particular subjective understandings about what's going on. And so when you encode value instruments in a protocol or on a platform, the value instruments are going to inherit the qualities of these underlying infrastructures. So let's look at some examples. Let's start with a protocol. A very nice protocol, in my opinion, is Secure Scuttlebutt. A gossip protocol, so each node keeps a log of all of the messages they send out. They link them together with hashes, and they sign each message, and they send them out and start gossiping these messages around. And you select your friends, and your friends start storing your messages, and you start storing your friends' messages. But there's no consensus. There's no objectivity in the state of the platform. There's all of these messages that you and your friends have sent out, but it's not a consensus protocol. In fact, many of the people that are participating on Secure Scuttlebutt are very much against consensus. But it's still possible to build a lot of interesting value instruments, even if you don't have an objective view of the system. You can, for example, build reputation systems quite nicely, because reputation, I would argue, is very much a subjective phenomenon. You know, in some cases, it might be useful to have a little bit of a higher degree of objectivity in the reputation, but it's really something that I decide how much I value all of you, and what reputation I'm willing to assign to you. And it makes the most sense, I think, as a subjective measure. Another example of a value that you can encode in the system is a mutual credit system. So if you just start issuing IOUs to people, then you don't necessarily need a global objective view of where all of these IOUs lie, because it might not even be the case that you recognize the IOUs of everybody. But you're presumably going to be recognizing the IOUs of your friends. And it's really easy to keep track of where the IOUs are. I mean, of course, everybody can double spend in a protocol like this, but if you double spend some IOUs, then that just means that you have now given debt to more people. And there's no limit to the amount of debt that you can give to yourself. I mean, at some point, maybe your friends start knocking on your door with a baseball bat and go for your kneecaps, but that's up to them. I mean, everything in a protocol like this is very much ad hoc and designed by the nodes in the network and the participants. So it's arguably way more decentralized than having an objective system. So another case study is DAOs. And in particular, I'm going to be focusing on plutocratic DAOs. So DAOs where you have some token holders and they're voting on what the DAO should do or how it should operate, and the vote is being weighted on the number of tokens that the participants have, because that's basically what we can do when we are operating on blockchains right now. So they form an objective decision based on the subjective views of the participants, but the subjective views of the participants are being weighted by the amount of tokens that they hold. And the level of decentralization that you can really achieve with a DAO is completely dependent on the token distribution. This is often not known to the majority of the participants in the network because it's really hard to say who owns what, or associate identities with accounts in the blockchain. And it's going to get a lot harder once we get better privacy techniques. So pretty soon we're not even going to be able to say whether a DAO is properly decentralized or not, because there's no way of reasonably knowing whether it is. So if our critique of the centralized systems and the centralized institutions that we're trying to escape from is that their governance mechanisms are opaque and they're being controlled by a select few, then we're likely not going to get away from this by using plutocratic DAOs because they have precisely the same properties. So I think this is one of the most pressing issues that the blockchain is facing right now, because we have all of these ideas on how we can bring more democratic inputs and notions of identity onto the blockchain, but it's really not happening as quickly as we are building up these plutocratic systems. And we really have to act quicker, I think, if we hope to have democratic control over these on-chain applications. So the question is, how do we build mechanisms by which we can have democratic input to the on-chain systems? Well, people start talking about decentralized identifiers, DIDs, and they're making progress, and it's really interesting, but it's very slow, and I haven't seen anybody using them on-chain yet, at least not for any substantial DAO. So I think we should start experimenting with our own solutions. It's very easy for example, to imagine that you and a couple of friends go together and you start identifying people, and you know, you can use Twitter, you can use Keybase, and you can use all of these ways in which people have been building up webs of trust off-chain, and you can just feed that onto the blockchain and start experimenting with giving people identities on-chain. And I think this is something we should do, even though it is riddled with problems everywhere, because I really think that by experimenting we'll get a lot of value out of it. So if there's a hackathon coming up, I would love to see stuff like this. You can plug it in to plutocratic systems. You can bundle your tokens together, and you can say that these tokens, instead of being simply voted on by individually by the token holders, you're going to decide collectively according to this identification protocol that you're given. But as I said, there are a lot of problems with on-chain voting systems. And to build one that is successful, really have to think really carefully about how to avoid coercion into voting in a particular way, or vote buying and stuff like that. Vote buying, by the way, in the worst case, degrades to what we have right now, so maybe it's not that bad. But paper voting is still a pretty safe method, so I think we should be looking more into how to have oracles input the result of paper voting onto the blockchain. And of course that relies on having some institutions that we need to trust, but they can still be competing for our trust. We don't have to rely on any one of them, because we can still fork if something goes wrong. But I really don't think that we can avoid the problem of having institutions in the generalized sense of what an institution might be. You know, it can be a process that is carefully thought through. So I'm going to do a final case study, which is going to be the case study of MakerDAO. And what I find to be particularly interesting, if we apply this analysis or this perspective that the value of a token is encoded in the process by which the token is created, and the language we use to describe how this token is created, then we can start by saying some pretty concrete things about the value encoded in DAI. First of all, we can say that the means of value production are distributed according to the token distribution of the underlying collateral. So the collateral that is being used to create DAI, the distribution of this token is going to influence the distribution of the mechanisms by which you can produce DAI. So if you have a bunch of ETH whales, then now you just produce a bunch of DAI whales. But also, we need to think more, I think, about not only the price of the assets that one might put into a system like that, but also the value of the assets that one puts into the system. So tokenized securities, coming up again here, as a particular kind of resource or an asset that might have a high price. And so from the pure microeconomic perspective, it is a temptation to add it as a form of collateral, whereas I really think that it would be detrimental from an ethical perspective to add some of these things. So we can think about land, natural resources, or intellectual property being tokenized and used as collateral. And maybe, depending on your particular view on these contractual rights, then you might be fine with that. But we can start thinking about oil drilling rights in the Arctic being tokenized and used as collateral. I really think that this is a horrible type of tokenization that we should actively be rejecting. I think it was in 2014, Martin Shkreli paid $55 million to purchase the marketing rights to Daraprim, an AIDS medicine. And 55 million, that's perfect, you know. Think about how much DAI one could be able to issue against that. I really think that this type of value is not something that we should accept at all in these decentralized systems. So that's about all I have to say. Let's see if I have some conclusions. I'm missing an emoji here. I really wanted to do this, this handshake between social science and technology, but apparently there wasn't support for this emoji in the PDF when I downloaded it. But let me just read out these conclusions. I think we cannot avoid thinking about the ethical implications of decentralized technologies. And we should recognize that right now, as these systems are still being built and experimented with, we have the potential of the most impact on the structure of these systems. They're as most malleable right now as they are still nascent. And we should emphasize which aspects of the current system we're trying to improve upon and share our ways of thinking about how to achieve those goals. And finally, we should embrace the opportunity to reconsider all of the contractual rights of the legacy financial world as they are being introduced into this sandbox that we have as tokenized securities. And we should think about which ones of these contractual rights we can recognize as legitimate in our brave new digital world. Thank you very much. Do I have time for questions, or? Yeah.
Hey. With the launch of multi-collateral DAI and the proposal to add a set of new ERC20 tokens as forms of collateral, do you think this will be a very pressing issue in the near term? For instance, I would use my MKR to vote against Tron or EOS being added to the system. And are those debates going to happen, and how do you think they'll play out?
So I think debates are definitely going to happen, and like tokenized securities are not a theoretical concern. Plenty of people are designing the legal infrastructure for how to bring them into the blockchain. I can't really speculate on how they're going to be relevant to MakerDAO at this point.
Hi. Great talk, Martin. Really great. So I wanted to point out it's really thought-provoking what you were saying. So for example, one of the things which I found made me think again and again is the dichotomy that is used in the language in our ecosystem. So on, off chain, centralized, decentralized, or subjective, objective. And the truth always lies somewhere in the middle. So for example, to be more concrete, say if I like you, I like this talk a lot, that's subjective, right? But when you create a system of liking, like a reputation system, it is intersubjective. And then when you get to a point of kind of a web of trust, you could argue it is proto-objective, it's still not objective, and objectivity is still we are looking for, as debatable whether it exists or not. So that might be an interesting way, and I don't know if you have thought about it. And similarly, like I just tried to change the conversation from subjective to objective to this four, like a spectrum. Yeah. Similarly on, off chain, and I think because we use this wrong, limiting terms, we have debates around should we have oracles, like the example you gave, which I'm really agreeing with. So I don't know if you have thought about, and one other thing is, when you talked about the ETH whales becoming DAI whales, do you see a world where it would be like a plug-and-play collateral? It won't be like just ETH. People will be able to choose their collateral, and there will be some sort of a, I don't know, social consensus, or I don't know what, which will decide whether it is ethically okay to have this collateral. You know, so that decision will be made on case basis, right? What do you think of
Yeah,
this?
yeah. I definitely think of objectivity and subjectivity as happening along a spectrum of intersubjectivity and
Proto-objectivity.
really, yeah, and you know, you could speak of a cultural hegemony happening on the objectivity axis, where you really just recognize one form of value, and that value happens to be dollars because that's the cultural hegemony that we live in. But still, that's not completely objective. I mean, it's not a fact of the world. It's just a common hallucination among people that we are willing, that we can't escape. And I really think what you say about social consensus is way more effective method of achieving a nice plethora of different kinds of values being represented and qualitative measures of arriving at those values. So I happen to think that the governance of Ethereum development is a perfect example of how good governance looks like. You know, there's long meetings, everybody brings their points across, and it takes a really long time, and everybody gets really upset. But this is like how functioning consensus-based decision-making works. And it has, for a very long time, been working this way. Because it really allows you to bring these qualitative arguments into consideration. And I think we need more of that. And it just is difficult to bring that qualitative decision-making onto the blockchain right now. And that's where I think oracles can play a big role.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We don't have much time.
I don't have more time for this, so thank you.